Welcome to the Pleasantville Garden Club show. I'm Billie Jean Sorensen, and our guest today is Dr. Neil Hendrickson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Hendrickson is with the Bartlett Tree Labs, and we have a lot of questions and important information to try to find out about today. We have had a couple of big storms here in Westchester this fall. We had Irene, and then we had that freak snowstorm at the end of October. And since so many trees were down, people are nervous about the situation, about what happens. I know one couple, friends of mine, had a tree trunk down through their living room, or branch down through their living room. And so could you give us a little advice about what people should do after such storms?
Yeah, sure. I think the first one is don't panic. Of course, it's easy to say if a tree hasn't come through your living room. But this really leads us to the whole science and art, and it's both, of tree risk assessment that arborists do. There's so much new information. It's become so complicated and yet so simple that the average arborist that you would call up will have to have a special qualification just to do assessments of your standing trees. And it's a 2.5-day course for an experienced arborist who has to qualify just to get the qualification. So it's people realize, even in our industry, that this is a big deal, and it's very complicated, and not everyone's qualified to do it. So the first thing is to try to get the tree inspected, and this leads to the point of finding a good arborist who can do this, because for many years, and this may still be true, for many years, if we tapped on a tree and it seemed hollow, we took it down. And after all the new arts and sciences that have come into this, we may still tap on a tree and take it down, but it may be that more and more arborists are asking the question is, why is this tree standing? If it's hollow and it withstood this storm, why would you want to take it down now? Because this is probably the worst event it'll ever experience. And so there are so many things to look at. And one of the simplest things is if you look at anything from a crane to a bridge to a table you could stand on, most structures that are quite strong are in fact hollow. If you take a paper towel tube, a toilet paper tube, put a dictionary on top of it, it's not going to collapse. So trees, ironically, respond to forces on them to adapt. So it's only when certain forces are so great that the trees fail. The point of that is it about the tree or is it really about the storm? In Central Park, I was fortunate enough to get there after a couple of big storms and looked at two stumps adjacent to each other of trees that failed. One stump was hollow, the other was perfectly sound. And I've been doing this tree risk assessment business for quite a while. Could I have predicted the failures? No. And the reason is because trees have a safety factor that they can stand in about 40 to 50 mile an hour winds. They're used to it. They're pretty well adapted, unless we have other problems with them, and it's not just about being hollow. So if a tree continues to grow, so for example, if the inside of a tree becomes hollow, the outside becomes wider, and it doesn't decay. New wood doesn't decay. So if you picture a solid structure, a dowel or something narrow and long, and something that's hollow but wider with a wider base, say a clarinet on top of a table. A tree can be hollow just like that and withstand all these forces. So again, it might be more about the storm. So when we focus on the trees, then we have to look at much more than that. And where the whole business of this is going has been a new field within the last really 10, 20 years of arboriculture called biomechanics. Sounds great, and it really is. And what people have done is everything from putting a big cable on a tree and pulling it with a tractor and letting the tree go to see how much force it would take to break it, to other people putting trees in windy areas and putting measurements on them to see how trees move in the wind. and because wind is typically the biggest load that trees ever experience. Now, the Snowtober storm showed that, well, if you get snow when there's leaves on the trees, that can be the biggest damage that they'll ever experience. But in most cases, then branches broke. The whole tree didn't fall over. Irene, the case was that when the ground was so wet that the roots wouldn't hold in it, and so we had saturated soils and wind. And if you get both of those, then any tree will go over in almost any wind because wind is also gusty.
But rain is more dangerous.
It can be. What's really interesting, and one of the things that we've talked about is soils. What we don't know is we really don't know how wet soils can be under how much wind. Think of how complicated the science would be to find out when a tree starts to move. And it turns out that trees don't move back and forth like, say, an inverted grandfather clock, like a pendulum. They oscillate randomly, and it's how they've adapted, and so that gusty winds never let them get a guitar string type harmonic. Trees are, it's really interesting stuff. Trees are detuned. It's as though you detuned an instrument so the string wouldn't make a sound but just wobbled. Well, trees do that. If they developed what's called a harmonic and vibrated nicely, then they would go faster and faster and fail. But they typically don't. But what we don't know is when we do get these gusts of wind coming from all directions and the soils are saturated and the roots won't hold, what's the key point at which they fail? And so when we just look at trees and see if they're hollow or if they're leaning or if they're cracked, it hardly tells us anything. We're just looking at the tree and not everything that affects it. So what really this whole business is going towards is what engineers call, and it's the engineers that have made this business interesting, not arborists. They've looked at it from an engineering standpoint and said, well, what we need to do is load analysis. What's the greatest load the tree gets? And we need to look at the loads on it. So a good arborist, if you're worried about your trees, having said all this, if you get a good arborist who's got the lights on and he comes on your property, one of the first things he'll look for is things that happened before. He'll look at the tree and said, if this is a big tree, why is it still standing if it's been exposed to storms for 50 and 60 years? This wasn't the worst storm it'll ever see, and it's still here. Why would you want to take it down? The other thing is, what makes me very nervous is another stump or an adjacent lot cleared, because wind, just like in, say, NASCAR racing, wind goes over a car, and you've probably seen ads where they show smoke going over a car. It's what's called laminar. It's nice, straight flow. And it goes over the top of groups of trees and doesn't get in the middle and get very turbulent. But
so are you saying that it's safer when you have a group of trees together than it is one tree standing alone?
You bet. And it's the change. That's where I was going with this, is that if you take a tree away, if there's a stump nearby, everything has changed, because your tree that you're worried about has been standing there by itself, but it's been buffered all these years. It's sort of like you're sitting on the beach and you've had an umbrella and the wind's been buffered by the umbrella or the sun, and suddenly you take it away and it's hot and it's windy. Well, the tree suddenly has a whole new set of conditions to deal with.
The tree that's left standing.
Yeah. And those conditions are, so here's the bet that you have to make, and this is why this is such a complicated process. The bet you're making is that your tree is healthy enough that it will grow in response to the new forces on it, because trees grow in response to the forces on them. So if it's old, it has to put down new wood where it feels the force on it. So trees do that. It's just like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You have a weight at the end of your arm and you do enough curls and you get a big bicep.
That's really fascinating, though, that a tree left standing alone after it's been buffered really has the strength to put out new branches, new roots to...
New roots, new wood, and the tree will put its strength wherever it needs it. It might need it in the roots and put it there. It might need it in the stem. And often as not, when I go out and look at a tree, you can see the bark separate a little bit and you'll see new wood inside.
Well, will that happen even with a tree that's older, like 40 years old?
And that's where it depends on, and this is why you need a good arborist, is number one, is the tree healthy? If the tree is already declining and dying back, it might not have the ability to do so. But if it's healthy and it's been kept healthy, it probably can. But here's the bet you make, getting back to that, is you're betting, if you leave the tree, that it will put down new growth to make itself stronger in the open before the next big storm. Because if the next big storm comes, now it's more exposed. Now it has more sail up there in its crown for the wind to push on that it wasn't used to.
So how long does it need to recover?
That can vary, but in an old tree, it could be 10 years, could be 20. In a young tree, it's much quicker, and a healthy tree much quicker. So this is why this whole business of what should I do about my tree after a storm is so complicated, and why it takes such a good, thoughtful arborist to talk you through it. Because most arborists, unfortunately, and it's our industry, will say, oh, it's hollow, it's got broken branches, it's got to come down. No, it doesn't, not often. It needs a careful analysis.
Okay, if you're looking for an arborist to work with, what questions should you ask in establishing that relationship?
Well, you know, it's a lot like any relationship with anyone, your physician or anybody that you have a relationship with. You want to be able to have a trust relationship. You want to develop a relationship because your trees need long-term care. If you simply hire the cheapest guy out of the yellow pages, you're going to get what you pay for. Most people to have someone with certification is good, but it doesn't necessarily say someone is either caring. It's usually the quickest buck to take a tree down. The tree is gone, the money's gone, the customer's gone. What a good arborist, I think, and it's subjective, wants to preserve trees. We're in the business because we care about them. So they wouldn't top your tree if you asked them, no matter how much you paid them. We wouldn't do horrible butchering to trees, and we wouldn't take them down for out of reason.
You never top big trees?
Never.
Never?
Never.
Okay.
There's not a single good thing that you can do. I will make one exception. You have a view of, you have the greatest view in the world, and a tree is growing up in the middle of it, and the view is worth more than the tree. So sometimes it's called vista pruning, and you literally top the trees, but you try not to literally butcher them.
Because it takes away some of the health of the tree?
First of all, you take away the entire crown, which is, it's like taking out a person's stomach. The tree's whole factory for making wood is in its leaves. And people who top trees say, well, sure, the trees come back. Yes, but the stem of a tree doesn't have a fuel gauge, but it's a fuel tank. We just can't see whether it's on empty or full, and we've talked about this indirectly. We don't know what, we have indirect evidence of whether a tree is healthy, and if its crown is very full, it probably has a pretty full fuel tank of a stem. So when you top a tree and take all its leaves away, you're essentially taking your bank account and taking all the principal and all the interest and hoping the little bit of money you left earns a lot of interest. And in a tree's version, it's will it sprout? And if it sprouts, will it put out enough leaves to start to grow that tree again? Well, often as not, it isn't. And so not only that, but the tree, when it sprouts out, the tank is now empty. So any more stresses, and the tree is likely to die. So usually topping a tree can be done once. And then the second time usually depletes it completely and eventually kills it. We see more standing topped dead trees than I'd like to think about. The other part of that is that when branches grow from when the tree is little, and they're managed properly by pruning over the life of the tree, they're very strongly attached to the tree. In this storm, sprouts were among the first branches that failed in the Snowtober storm because sprouts come out from the edge of the bark. They're not anchored into the tree. A branch that grows up with the tree, remarkably enough, the closest analogy in human life is that you cranked a lag bolt into a telephone pole. That's how branches actually grow, is that the branch wood is the bolt, and the threads on it are the stem. They lock it in like that. So when you grow a branch from a sprout on the outside, it's basically like putting in a push pin and then putting in a lot of weight. They're very prone to failure. So not only are they prone to failure, the tree is now out of gas. On and on it goes, and if you top the wrong tree, you'll get what's called sun scald. which you also could get when trees are storm damaged, by the way. If you get apple trees or beech trees that are heavily storm damaged this winter and have branch breakage and they're thin barked and suddenly get baked by the sun, we can get sun scald and you'll get all these dead areas that weren't dead before. So there are some really big issues, and this is why when you look for an arborist, you want to have a relationship. You don't want to have a one-time situation where you've got the low bid, unless you just want to get your tree down and out, and then fine.
Or if you have a damaged tree and you can't get, it's hard to get someone to come after a big storm because everyone's so busy. So.
And the other thing is, it's as a business, arboriculture requires skill. You have big equipment, you have chippers, and you're handling trees. And if you've been in the top of a tree and looking down, what you usually see is houses, sidewalks, play sets. So the people who are usually cheapest are often uninsured or poorly insured.
Well, yes, insurance would be really a key, wouldn't it?
And if something goes wrong, you want to have, as with any relationship, whether it's a car mechanic, a plumber, an electrician, a doctor, someone who will be accountable, that you can say, I didn't like the way this worked out, or I still have a problem. Any reasonable person in today's world will say, I will take care of it. Well, and that's why we're very big on customer service and doing the right thing. As the old saying goes, in arboriculture, we take care of trees, but we really take care of people.
Yeah.
So it's all about customer service and about that relationship. So
you really have to find someone who gives you all of those.
And who gives you, and when you ask questions, just as you're asking me, you want to be sure that that person can give you a reasonable answer, and then, sure, talk to somebody else and see if the answers are consistent.
Maybe ask other people, ask them for referrals.
And the other part is there is a ton of information on the internet now.
Good idea.
The International Society of Arboriculture, our organization, I believe, has a site. If you simply typed in trees are good, there's either frequently asked questions, as there are on so many things, or you can submit a question. But if you Google that sort of thing or do an internet search, those sorts of things will come up and you can get pretty good information. But in the case of something we talked about earlier about anti-transference on leaves, many people advocate them, but the scientists don't. So how do you decide?
So that's a great idea, though, to get a lot of information from the internet. You can Google almost anything and get some.
Be an informed consumer. That's the best thing. As with so many, as after any storm, people will come out to do anything from paving your driveway to cutting your trees and have no experience, no ability, and they're just looking for a quick buck.
Be careful.
Look for someone who's been around a while.
Yeah, be careful. Is that all you have to say about hazardous situations?
The other thing about that is we're in the wintertime, and so we started to talk about this a little bit. We won't know a lot this year, and winter has a long way to go yet. So we've had drought last summer that was brief but intense. We had a very wet fall, very warm. All the things that are happening affect a tree. A tree is the sum of everything that has happened to it. Same with shrubs. So I would say this spring, and you just mentioned this briefly, is don't try to get an arborist after the problem has happened. This is why a relationship is good, because and certainly in our business and things like that, we'll take care of people who we've been with and we know their trees, and when they need us, it's like anyone else. If you go to a physician when you suspect a problem that you have a relationship with, that's probably better in your long-term interest than going to the emergency room. Same sort of analogy with trees. So come spring, before all the buds break, talk to an arborist, build that relationship, have that arborist look at the trees and know what he or she is going to look for as the buds break, as the insects come out, as the disease develops. Be sure you get the diagnostics done, and as in with any management program, whether it be managing money, managing business, the idea is to develop a management plan for your property, see how that works, and update it periodically to make sure you're on the right track. And so we will often say when we see a client, where do you want your property to be in 10 years? If you want it to look like this, exactly as it does now, don't forget, trees grow. These will be the steps you have to take. If you don't care, or your kids are going to be out of high school and you're going to move in 2 to 3 years, our management proposal might be entirely different. And it goes back to storm damage. If you have very low risk tolerance, and we see clients that no matter what, after what, everything I've just talked to you about, no, I'm scared about that tree every time the wind blows. And I can remember a client, we did a lot of work inspecting and making sure the tree was stable. The next windstorm, she went to a hotel, said, I have to have the tree down. Okay. So it's a lot about us educating our clients so that they understand the actual risks and not just the worries.
But if she's that frightened, she should have the tree down.
Yep.
That's my opinion.
And we do that.
Yeah.
Reluctantly. But that's the other part of it. It's a lot about, this is where coming and taking care of people as well as taking care of trees. If the tree makes them that nervous, okay, fine, we do removals, just reluctantly. We want to be sure it's justified.
I've been hearing about the emerald ash borer and that we are losing a lot of our ash trees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. Ash trees are doomed. It's almost that simple. This insect is so difficult to see. It's very small. Its exit holes are very, very small. I was recently in Toronto where the outbreak is enormous, taken to a place where the infestation is in full blast. And I couldn't tell. The only way you can tell is if you, fortunately in New York, it's now so been discovered in western New York and in some of the eastern counties, at least, that turned up in traps. There's an infestation not far from here, near West Point. And but the idea is we will never see it until you see the activity of woodpeckers. Can individual trees be treated? Yeah, there's a systemic insecticide that can be applied, and it ranges from inexpensive to very expensive. But can trees be protected? Yes, but they have to be protected either annually or every other year, forever. Other than that, ash trees have been on the way out for a while. In general, we've seen either environmental stresses or what is called ash yellows, which is a disease very difficult to diagnose and very difficult to describe, but it has been killing ash trees too. So this is sort of just basically finishing them off. But individual trees on a homeowner's property can easily be protected, and it's best to do so well before the insect arrives. They talk about treating when the nearest detection is 15 miles away. But if you're nervous, it's prudent to do so if you have a specimen ash tree. But overall, ashes are probably going the way of American chestnut because there's no insect, no treatment large scale that can be done to help them.
That's happening to a chestnut tree too?
It's happened. I mean, the American chestnuts were gone by 1920, 1930 due to chestnut blight. Another introduced problem, the Asian longhorn beetle, the emerald ash borer, were also introduced as consequences of pallet wood in global trade.
So what trees would you recommend, or do you have any special?
It's actually pretty funny because the story is it hasn't arrived here and as a great problem yet, but in New Jersey there is a disease called bacterial leaf scorch that extends all the way down to Washington, D.C., excuse me, and points south, which is fatal, bacterial. Once it gets in red oaks and pin oaks, it kills them. Can it be treated? Yes. Is it expensive? Yes. So there's a disease there. So if you live in New Jersey, you don't plant red or pin oaks. You wouldn't plant ashes. Elms are now resistant, so we're reintroducing them. But Asian longhorn beetle is still somewhere out there. Right now, the big outbreak is in Worcester, Mass. And the great concern is that Worcester is an urban area on the southern edge of sugar mapling country, and sugar maple is one of its favorite species. And we're, as a company, very heavily involved in trying to manage it to keep the outbreak from spreading. But if the Asian longhorn beetle spreads we lose maples, well, perhaps we shouldn't be planting maples. Norway maples are a popular species. They're highly invasive. No one wants to plant those. So the idea, and in fact, this is a key point where arboriculture is going to. People say plant natives. And what we would respond is no, plant adapted, because natives are sometimes attacked by these invasive pests. Plant highly adapted plants because in the context of climate change, what's adapted is changing too. if you believe what climate change scientists are saying, in 10 years we'll be planting native to Richmond, and in 30 years we'll be planting native to Atlanta. So that's why you can often see plants that we couldn't grow before overwintering pretty successfully, like crepe myrtles and even some other southern plants that didn't grow here before. Camellias are growing here, and yes, there are more hardy varieties, but still it is gradually warming, and that's the trend. So as far as what plant, anything that you want, as long as you do everything you can culturally, watering it properly, having good soil conditions, having the root flare at grade, give it every chance to live its full life here.
And leave the mulch at least a foot away from the
yes,
trunk.
absolutely. Or just not around the base. Make sure the flare. Mulch is the best thing in the world for a plant, the single best health treatment, the best thing we recommend, and it's also the worst. It just depends on how it's used.
Okay. Could we talk just a little bit about roses? Should you be cutting back your roses in the fall or waiting until the spring? And should you mulch or should you use cow manure or something in the spring to give them?
Well, actually, since we were on the subject of mulching, the thing about compost and mulch is that anything organic, organic matter is basically for roses or anything else one of the best things. But it's as with everything else, if you walk in the woods in the fall, you'll see leaves on a trail perhaps, and you won't see the trail as clearly. Come spring, you usually can. Turnover of mulch is usually relatively quick into compost. But what we see in all of the soil tests that we do is that there's a lack of soil organic matter in most cases. And one of our most common recommendations is mulch. And when we use this air tool that I described earlier to turn over soils and decompact them, we incorporate compost. So we do, the best plant health care for roses or anything else is to simulate how nature would grow them, which is a soil rich in organic matter. What we try to do fundamentally as plant health care, whether it be roses, annuals, perennials, and trees, is to create ideal soil conditions, those that they would have liked to grow in where they grew. And this is when it gets back to what should I plant? It goes back to creating ideal conditions as best you can. Your drought is out of your control, but you can mitigate that with water. And everything else has getting the soil organic matter to about 5% by volume of soil. And if you do that, almost everything else is possible. And as far as things like fall planting hazards that we hear about, it's more about the water and the soil conditions, whether it's roses or plants or anything else. It's all about getting the soil conditions right. All those other problems tend to be minimized.
Okay, we've just about run out of time. We have maybe another minute if there's any last word you would like to tell our gardeners and tree owners.
Well, it'll be an interesting winter. If you have arborvitaes and we get heavy snow, brush it off of those plants. And the thing to be aware of is to look in gardening. People keep garden calendars. I've even started to keep track of the record lows and see what follows it, or the record highs and see what follows it, because you can get a pretty good idea of what might be out there. Because there is one disease that's become very big because of moisture that we didn't see so much, and that's called fire blight. And that has to be pruned out come spring, and it comes from wet conditions. So this is why you also need a competent arborist who can identify that. Yeah. And that'll be come spring. So have somebody visit your property just before buds are breaking, before they get too busy, and build a relationship with a good one.
Okay, well, thanks again for all the good information.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thank you for watching.